Comrades, the Independent Socialist Network notes the resolution that's been submitted by the TUSC steering committee to this conference. Some of you will be aware that in 2014 we actually declined to take part in the No to EU project for the European elections in that year. We hope, therefore, that it's clear from the outset that the opinion of our members is generally against any campaign for Britain to withdraw from the European Union. I'll go over the reasons for that in this contribution. Just as a side note, I point out that we as the ISN would have actually had the right to, under the way TUSC functions, veto TUSC taking an anti-EU stance. We chose not to. We decided that would be the wrong path to take. We preferred instead that it be debated and discussed at this conference. We actually think that that's a principle that if we want to build a new party of the working class, then it has to function to a democratic standard, which is that conference should be the highest sovereign body where all major policy is made. So I think it's important to note that. Now, on the question of Europe, on the issue here, what I think we have to remember that perhaps we're losing sight of slightly is that we're not debating whether we're pro or anti-European, as Mark noted. We're also not debating whether we are for or against the European Union as presently constituted. What we are debating is how we should vote in a specific referendum at this specific time with a very specific question, whether Britain alone should unilaterally separate itself off from the European Union. And that's what we need to keep topmost in our minds. Now, there's a concept that's raised sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, about an exit with socialist policies. And we think that's fundamentally misguided. First of all, that is simply not one of the choices on offer. The commitment in the resolution to distinguish TUSC from the establishment no campaign, if you like, is welcome but inadequate in our view. Now, we only need to look at the votes received in previous years by UKIP as compared to No to EU to see where the genuine the substantial force and momentum lies in the Eurosceptic camp. So, and we should, and by the way, we should also take into account that although UKIP are a thoroughly reactionary force, in terms of their social base, who votes for them, there are various surveys which show that their voters are predominantly working class in line with the Labour Party. Now, left-wing Euroscepticism barely makes a dent in competing for much the same sort of constituency of voters in that case. So, in my view, if the country votes no, it will be a victory for UKIP and for the hard right, whose motivation for withdrawal is precisely because it will allow them to ratchet up their campaign of hatred against migrants and, of course, to do away with the few but significant protections which are afforded to workers by the EU. To claim any credit for TUSC in the event of a no vote carrying the day is just completely misguided in my view. It'd be like stowaways congratulating themselves because they managed to sneak aboard the Titanic at Southampton. It's not something that we can claim any serious credit for, and it would not be our victory by any means. Now, obviously our concern is for the rights and the welfare of our class, and following on from that, I think if you argue for separation, what you're implying is that there is a national solution to austerity. There's a solution to austerity within the nation state. And following on from that, I'd argue that it implies there's a national road to socialism. We only need, however, as Greece was alluded to in previous comments, we only need to look at the experience of Syriza in Greece to see how wrong that is. Tsipras and his critics agonised over the dilemma of whether or not to break with the EU, break with Europe, completely overlooking the fact that what was needed was a break with capitalism, and that's the question that's never confronted. It's not about the EU, it's not about the nation state, it's about whether you break with your ruling class inside your own country and abroad as well. So, if we say that the EU is, in its own right, on its own, a significant barrier to any other, to Britain or any other nation state adopting so-called socialist policies like, nationalisation, that sort of thing, what I would like to put is, why does that necessarily follow that we should give the ruling class an easy ride by quitting the EU before we even try and implement our programme? Why would we, why would we do that even at a time of weakness for our movement, when Nigel Farage is in a position of strength? Now, the logical conclusion I would draw is that if Britain tried to implement socialist policies, as been sort of alluded to there, then that would drive it towards being forced into expulsion from the EU. Now, our response, in my opinion, should be so be it. You know, as socialists and internationalists, we should push that struggle forwards, take that struggle to the highest level, confront the ruling class, expose their contempt and disdain for democracy. You know, that we should make clear that we won't sacrifice our commitment to freedom of movement, we won't sacrifice any of the social protections that we have, we won't concede even an inch just to make their lives easier by quitting before we're forced down. So more importantly, you know, leaving without a fight would desert, you know, would desert our comrades in struggle across Europe, especially in Greece, where the success of the struggle in Greece depends on the emergence of a united movement across the continent in order to support them, in order to defend them. I would argue that withdrawing from the EU on our own, becoming isolationists, would be a massive setback to building that united movement. Now, there are also advocates of separation who counterpose their plans with our supposed desire to reform the EU in workers' interests. This is something we've never advocated. It's, you know, I don't understand why it gets raised, you know, all the time. And of course, the only example that can be found of people who do believe that were, you know, people like Caroline Lucas, who's very, very far from our politics. You know, we don't think that either the nation state or the EU can be made to serve our interests. But there are other objectives that can be, you know, furthered and pursued by staying in the European Union to fight. And not least among those is the building of a continental and then a global movement to transform society. I just note we should not be primarily interested in symbolism or gesture politics. We deal with the material realities of, you know, of this situation as they stand, and with the consequences of our actions. So, although the injustices and inadequacies of the EU are many, we should not, you know, as much as we might like to cast a symbolic vote against those, we have to be, you know, always in top of our minds have to be the practical consequences of voting to leave the EU. That must be it, not the symbolism of, you know, how satisfying it is to vote no. So, most important among those is a significant threat to the, you know, over 2 million nationals of other EU countries currently resident in the UK. First of all, Britain withdrawing from the EU would nullify their the basis of their right to live in this country. You know, I don't see how, you know, we can in the same breath, you know, espouse support for Polish workers to live here when we're actually pursuing a policy that could result in them being sent home, conceivably. You know, that needs to be reconciled, and it's not adequately by the people who support the no vote. And, you know, that's without even factoring in the almost 2 million UK citizens who currently live in other EU countries who will be forced to return here potentially, you know, which would cause, you know, serious consequences for our NHS, system of social care, housing, all of these things. These are concrete consequences, not abstractions. These are things that we have to consider when forming our policy. Now, the entire strategy of the ruling class in relation to migrants, and especially the establishment media, has been to, you know, delegitimise their presence here, delegitimise the basis on which they're here, you know, claiming that they steal jobs from British workers, or they're, you know, concealing their real motive through immigration. But we must be clear what, you know, what a vote for withdrawal would actually mean. What it would do is place UKIP and the Tory right in the ascendant. It would make them a much more powerful force in this country. So for migrants, that would mean heightened oppression by the state and the border authorities. It would mean increased exploitation of work as employers press home their advantage, because, you know, who's going to complain if you think you might be deported? And it, you know, could lead to racist attacks by fascists. This is such a serious threat. This should be something that we consider very seriously. Now, even if the consequences for us domestically weren't serious enough to make us pause and think about it, we only need to look beyond our borders to see what a step backwards separation would be. Socialism is international, or it is nothing. There are those in our movement who say that freedom of movement, freedom to cross borders, only benefits the bosses, or worse, that it's pure and simple an invention of the bosses to drive down wages and drive down conditions. Comrades, we reject that view as simplistic and blinkered. You know, if someone chooses to move within their own country to better their life, you know, if someone chooses to, I don't know, study in Scotland to, you know, to take advantage of free tuition, we wouldn't bat an eyelid. Why then should we, you know, be so concerned about people crossing borders? What, you know, there are many experienced trade unionists in the room. They don't need me to tell them that the answer is a strong, united labour movement which can integrate their struggles and their, you know, their aspirations into our own and seek to, you know, defend us all in a united way. And by the way, that does not, you know, the issue of Fortress Europe has been raised as a sort of, oh, well, why are you talking about freedom of movement? There's no freedom of movement into the EU. I mean, it's a valid point, but if you think about it, What would withdrawing from the EU do in any way to make the passage across the Mediterranean more safe for refugees? What would it do to break down the borders of Fortress Europe? Absolutely nothing. So we must recognise what's being proposed is actually just the detachment of the British capitalist class off from their European allies. Now, notwithstanding the carnival of reaction that we think would be directed against migrants and other sections of our class vulnerable to scapegoating, the labour, the labour market and trade policies that would be pursued would be basically a headlong rush to exactly the same sort of free trade area that's been used by America to cripple social protections in Korea, Latin America, all over the world. It's unlike our struggle against TTIP, we would stand alone in that fight. That's something we should take into consideration. So, for all the reasons that I've set before you there, we strongly believe that a vote for Britain to leave the EU in this referendum, at this very particular point in our history, would leave the country a more isolationist, more inward-looking place. Supposed benefits to the working class of withdrawal are just a mirage. They won't materialise. The cost to our struggle, the setbacks to our goal of a united movement which can fight for a socialist Europe, are potentially irrevocable. If we're to see the world and see politics as it truly is, we must not vote no. Well, comrades, first of all, I suppose the remarks that I'd like to respond to first are those that Hugh made when he talks about the funding that UKIP received and how the knock-on effect of withdrawing from the EU would be that UKIP would be cut off from all their funding. Of course, it's not true, because UKIP now have an MP who gets short money, what's called short money, which is allocated to MPs of all parties depending on the number of votes they receive, not depending on how many MPs they have, but the number of votes they get across the country. And of course that's a very serious prospect when UKIP are coming in second place across the north-east, parts of the south-west, and would only be increased, I would argue, in the event of Cameron carrying the day, his reforms being endorsed to stay in the EU. I think we'd see defections from the Tory right to UKIP, more funding for UKIP, so I don't think that stands up personally. What I'd like to say, actually, as a general principle, is that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact, yes, the face of oppression in Greece and countries like that has been, one of EU's institutions. It's been the rule of the bondholders. But the rule of the bondholders applies in the international community, whether you're inside the EU or outside it. As soon as Britain, if Britain's outside the EU, even if it tries to implement any vaguely left-leaning policies, what will be the first thing to happen? The markets will take a dive, they'll speculate against the currency, all these sorts of things. So arguments that withdrawing from the EU would make it easier to renationalise the railways, no, I don't think it would, even for a second. I don't think that's a serious prospect, and I don't think the scale of that sort of advantage is really sort of relevant in the discussion. Vladimir, I thought, made some interesting points. He was talking about who you're lining up with and whether the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And clearly not. I never suggested that people voting for a no were lining up with UKIP, lining up with racists. But what I am saying is that if the vote goes to no, if this country withdraws from the EU, then the material consequences of that will be strengthening of the right wing. It will be the right wing's victory, not ours. So, Tomasz talked about pessimism. I don't think it's pessimism, I think it's realism. Will withdrawal weaken the ruling class? No, I don't think so, because Britain is already peripheral in the EU. I don't think Britain splitting off on its own would weaken, the EU leadership in any way, shape or form. So once again, I'd say, do not vote no.